Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Ayin Gimel. On the bottom of daf Ayin Beis Amid Beis, the Gemara was discussing a case of a fetus in the womb of its mother of an animal, and the fetus extended its foreleg outside of the womb. And the Chacham are of the opinion that that foreleg has the status of a treifa, because it went chutz l'mechitzoso. And the Gemara introduces a principle here on the bottom of Daf Ayin Beis Amid Beis in the name of Ravina, and that is Kol ha'omed lachtok kichotuch dami. That's something that will be severed, because what are you going to do with this extended leg? Since the shechita cannot be matirit, you can't permit it for consumption because it's a treifa. So therefore, we have to assume that the person will sever that limb because it's osur, and that's called kechotuch dami. And this will solve the issue that the Gemara was dealing with on Daf Ayin Beis Amid Beis called Tumas Beis Hastorim, which is Tumah in a private place. And the Gemara is saying that once they would cut off that limb, and now we view it as if it was already cut off, then the contact between the different parts of the limb is called revealed. It's called begolui. It's no longer beis hastarim. And the Gemara asks, Kiman, where do we find a source for this concept of kechotuch dami? So we're now here on the top of Daf Ayin Gimel and Beis, and the Gemara explains Ravina by saying, Ki Rabbi Meir, the son, we have a Mishnah, Masechta Mikvos, with regard to a kli and its handle, and how much of the kli has to be immersed into the mikvah in event that the kli is tameh. Kol yodos hakelim sheina ruchos, the asid lekotzitzan, matbil ad moko mida, divrei Reb Meir. So it means that since he intends, in this case, asid, his plan is to sever that handle and remove it from its attachment to the utensil. Therefore, as far as tefillah is concerned, all he has to be tovel is up to the point of the measure. That's called ad makom mida, up to the point of the measure, which means up to the point where he intends to retain that part of the utensil, and not beyond, which is the point in which he's going to cut it off. Chacham disagree, and they hold ad sheyatbil eskulo. So now it seems that Ravina is really standing on the shoulders of Rabbi Meir, but we, although it's true and we can't deny it, that Rabbi Meir considers that something that's about to be cut off and it's omed lekach, it's as though it's being cut off, but the Rabbanah and the Chacham never accepted that. And therefore, shall we assume that Ravina is based on Rab Meir against the Chachamim? The Gemara answers no. Afilu tema Rabbanon chiburi ochlin command de mifrasei dami unegie behadodi. The Gemara makes a distinction between foodstuffs and utensils. When it comes to foodstuffs, then if you're going to cut it off, like for example that foreleg that's treifa, then even the Rabbanah would agree to Rabbi Meir's principle that kechotuch dami, it's as if it's already been severed. But in a case of ochlin, if you have food that's attached one part to another, even though you intend to cut them apart, the Rabbanan say that we're not going to consider it as if it was already cut. And that's not in any way comparable to our Mishnah, because our Mishnah is talking about portions of the limb, and therefore we're going to apply this principle. Now the Gemara goes back to Ula for a moment. It says, Bishlem Ula Hainu de Ketani Chatacha. We understand that according to Ula, the Mishnah had to go as far as saying that he actually severed that protruding limb. El Ravina, my chatoch, according to Ravina, if it's considered chatuch, just because it stands to be severed, then why did the Mishnah have to say chatocha? And the Gemara says, "Aidi." It's only a literary need for that. The Tani Reisha chatocha, Tananami Sefer chatocha. Okay. So now basically we start Daf Ayin Gimel, v'chachamim omrim, maga treifa shchuta. Now what happens here is that you have this leg that was protruded past the womb, and we said it has the status of a treifa. And now we're going to say that maga treifa, the flesh that's in contact with the slaughtered treifa, is also tummy. So the Gemara asks, what are you talking about? Treifa shchuta mimetama. There's no such thing as tumah over here. After all, the shchita itself is mitayer, the treifa midei nevela, so it doesn't have any tumah to it. So what's this whole business that the Rabbanan say in our Mishnah that maga treifa shchuta? You're right, on a doraisa level there is no transmission of tumah, but on a Drabbana level in Kodshim, we have a special halacha, uvua tishmuel, treifa sheshchata betama b'mukdashim. The Drabbana made a decree, and they established that a treifa animal, if it's slaughtered, it will transmit tumah if it was consecrated as a korban. So a consecrated offering was slaughtered, found to be a treifa. That's our case. The meat is called tameh midrabanan. And our Mishnah says that if you have a consecrated female that was giving birth, and its fetus put forth a limb and extended that limb outside of its womb, and now that limb becomes treifa, if the mother was slaughtered before the limb was severed, the remaining flesh of the fetus itself now is susceptible to tumah midrabanan because it was consecrated its kodshim. If, on the other hand, the mother in a regular case was not mukdeshes, there was no consecration, then the limb and the flesh that touched it are all tahor. The Gemara continues and quotes the argument of the Chacham against Rabbi Meir. Ma motzinu b'treifa sheshchitas metarasa af shchitas behema titayr es ha'ever. We find that in a treifa case, if you shech the treifa animal, then you retire it. The shchita is metayr midei nevela. Is therefore, says the Chacham, by analogy, in our case, the shchita of the mother should be metayr that limb of the fetus that was extended beyond the womb and protected from being contaminated, being tameh as nevela. And Reb Meir counter-argued. He says that doesn't mean a thing to me. Why? Because the shchita of a treifa, okay, it's metayr the animal itself. That I can understand. In other words, the shchita could effectuate a tahara for that which is in its body. But when we're talking about the limb that's protruding outside of the fetus, outside of the womb of the mother, that's not part of the body anymore. And therefore, according to Reb Meir's argument, that limb itself has the same status as nevela. Tanya, we learned in a brisa, this is a slightly different version of the machlok between Reb Meir Chacham. Amalahem Rabbi Meir. Reb Meir says to the Chacham, "V'chi mi tiaro li'ever zemi de nevela." I have to admit that there is a shchita that could be related to the aver, to that extended limb, and that's the shchita of the mother. And now we're going into the principle here that shchita sa'em works for the entire body of the animal, of the female that gave birth, even for that extended limb. But if you're going to go with that logic, argues Rabbi against the Chacham, why don't you go one step further and say, well, if you're understanding that the limb that was protruded is part of the animal, then, and therefore the shchita will be metayer that limb, then the shchita should be mater that limb even for achila, insofar as the shchita was done on the animal, on the cow, we'll call it, and that shechita relates to the uh, to the entire fetus, meaning even to the limb that was extended. Amulo, what are you talking about? Habe matzelas al she'ena gufa yosemi begufa. The principle that underlies our Mishnah is that the shechita is much more effective for something that's not part of the body. It's a little bit counterintuitive, and as opposed to something in its body, right? Because let's say you cut off from the uber kidneys or spleen, and then you leave it inside the animal, the shechita is not matir. It's also bachila. So therefore, the Chacham are arguing that Haresha Nina, we learned that chotech mina ubar shebemeyeha mutar bachila. If you cut off a part of the fetus and you leave it inside the body of the mother, then when you shech the mother, that shechita is effective and effectuates a heter even for those parts of the fetus that you cut off. But if, on the other hand, it's migufa, if it's the tchol and the klayos, and even if he leaves it inside the animal, asur b'achila. So now the Gemara wants to analyze this logic of the Chacham. Maika Amar, what is really the underlying logic of the Chacham? Amar Rava, Amri Li Kidi. Kidi might be the name of a Chacham, or more likely it's some anonymous Chacham, we don't know his name. Chisuri Mechsavach Tani, we have to add something to the Brisa. Amar Lehem Rabbi Meir. Meir says to the Chacham, V'chi mi taro, mi tiaro, li ever zeh midei nivela. Right? Rabbi Meir wants to know, you're gonna have to introduce the shechita to the mother. And so once you introduce the shechita to the mother to be matami de nevela, go one step further and be consistent and let the shechita be mati b'achila. Shechita simo im kain tatirenu b'achila. Amru lo, the chacham say treifa tochia. I mean, you don't deny the case. Forget about the protruded limb that we're dealing with. What about a regular case of a treifa? There's an animal that's a treifa, and you went ahead and you shechted it. And the halacha is shchitasa metarasa midei nevela, that the shchita is meaningful to be metar midei nevela, even though eina matira b'achila. So what are you proving to me, Rabbi Meir, from this case of the extended limb? Well, that distinction is built into the very structure of shchita of a treifa. The shchita of the treifa does not effectuate a heter on the achila of the basar, but does effectuate a tahara process with regard to tumas nevela. Amalehem, Rabbi Meir responds to the Chachamim, Lo im tiara shchitas treifa oso davar shehi gufa titire es ha'ever davar she'ena gufa. Yes, I understand, and I concede to you, says Rabbi to the Chachamim, that if you shech the treifa, then that shechita is meaningful to be metar the treifa midei nevela. Why? Because the treifa is its own body. So the shechita is done on its body. The body is treif, and now the shechita is going to be metar midei nevela. But in the case of the aver, a protruding limb, that's davar she'ena begufa. In other words, the Rabbi Meir sees it as if that limb was already severed, as we discussed earlier, and therefore it's not part of the body of its mother, and therefore how could the shechita of the mother be in any way chalos, could in any way engender any sort of legal change if now we're talking about the aver that's not part of the guf? And again, even though physically it is part of the guf, but it's not part of the guf according to halacha. Amrulei, so they responded, Harbe matzelas al she'ena gufa yosemi guf. On the contrary, the halacha of purification from nevela through shchita is even more effective for something that's not part of the guf. And how do I prove that to you? Sharei shaninu chotech mina ubar shebeme'eha is mutabachila. If let's say he chops off part of the fetus and he leaves it inside, and then he shechs some other animal, then you're allowed to eat the chopped part of the uber. But minat cholu minat kloyos, if he detaches part of the spleen or the kidneys, even if he leaves it inside the animal and then he shechs the animal, asur b'achila. So we see that the shechita of the mother is more effective for parts of the fetus than for parts of its own body. And we know that the shechita of a treifa affects purification for its own body. How much more so would it effectuate a purification, l'tayr midei nevela, as far as the limb that was extended beyond the womb. Tanya nami hachi. Now the Gemara wants to bring a brisa that supports everything that we said. Amar lehem Rabbi Meir said to the Chachamim, "V'chi mitaru li'ever zeh midei nevela amru lo shchitas ha'em." Im kain, so Rabbi Meir wanted to be consistent that the Tirena B'achila go a step further and say that the shchita is going to be matir the leg that was extended. Amrullah, what are you talking about? Treifa toch here. How do you see it in the case of Treifa? The shchita clearly is matar midei nevela, but it's not matar b'achila. Shchitasa matares midei nevela v'yena matir b'achila. So what are you proving to me in terms of the protruding limb? The protruding limb, it could be that even though the shechita of the mother is not meaningful to be matir the achila of that limb, but nevertheless it's mitayar b'dei nevela, and we see it already in treif. Amalahem, Meir responds to that argument. Im tiara shchitas treifa osa vesa evra meduldal ba'davar shebegufa tetaras ha'ubar she'ena begufa. I don't understand your comparison, says Rebbe to the Chachamim. You're right that the shechita of a treifa is mitayar, the carcass of that animal itself, from nevela, and the shechita of the animal is mitayar midei nevela, a limb that is mostly attached but still dangling, mostly detached but it's still dangling, like there's a thin skin that's holding on to it. So that's a davar shebegufa, and therefore to tire es ha'ubar. It makes sense that you can be tire the ubar. That's fine. But she'ena begufa, that which is not part of its guf, like for example the extended limb, that doesn't lend itself to the tira through the shechita. Amrulo harbi matzel sal she'ena gufa yosemi gufa she'ishaninu chotech min ha'ubar shebemeyeha. Mutar b'achila min ha'tchol u'min ha'klayos asur b'achila. Okay, so now we're going to discuss this case called an Ever Midul Deles, which was mentioned here in the Shakla that was recorded by the Bryce. So Omer Rav Shimon ben Lakish, ki machlokes be'ubrin, kach machlokes be'evarim. Right, we have machlokes between the Chacham and Reb Meir with regard to the protruding limb of the fetus. Is it purified through the shechita of the mother, or is it not? And says Reish Lakish, we have a parallel machlokes with regard to avarim. So what are avarim? That's the aver b'dul deles, and that's a limb that's dangling from the animal. It's barely attached to the animal through a membrane of a skin. And the question is whether those limbs of aver b'dul deles are subject to tara through the shechita of the mother. And according to Chacham, the shechita is going to be matzil, it's going to protect the limbs from acquiring tumas nevela. Reb Meir holds no. So that's a machlokas as far as Ever Medulelis. And Reish Lakish starts with the machlokas be'ubrin, and he applies it and expands it to include the case of Ever Medulelis. Who disagrees with Rav Shimon Lakish? As usual, Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan Amar machlokas be'ever de ubar. The whole machlok between Reb Meir and the Chachamim is limited to the case of the extended limb of the fetus. Then the Chachamim say that the shechita would have the ability to be metayar the limb. Avol be'ever de behema. What about the dangling limb of the animal? So we're no longer talking about a protruding limb of the fetus, but rather a limb of the animal itself. Divrei HaKol Shchita Osa Nipul, which means that the shechita itself effectuates a situation of detachment. Detachment is the English counterpart to nipul, meaning that the um, the aver of the behemoth now becomes aver min achai. And what makes it into aver min achai? It's the shechita. The shechita itself effectuates that this aver is now detached from the animal and has the status of an aver min achai. So this is Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, my time with Rabbi Yochanan, I'll leave it to Rabbanon. What is the explanation of Rabbi Yochanan's understanding of the Chachamim? Why should the Chachamim hold that the Shechita would not be mitayr an aver miduldeles of the animal itself when they rule that it does purify the protruded limb that went out of the bounds of the mother's womb? Hi isle takanta bechazara, hi lesle takanta bechazara. If you were to cut off the limb, you can't put it back together. You can't put it back on. But hi, in the case of the extended limb, what you could do is you could sever it and put it back into the womb. And we said that if you sever part of the fetus and put it back into the womb, then the shechita is matir afilu b'achila, that part of the fetus. But v'ha, in the case of flesh that's sort of ripped off the animal, like it's dangling, is less le takanta b'chazar. You can never return it to its original state. Meisvei. The Gemara now asks the Kashan Rabbi Yochanan. We have a brisa that says, Amar Lehem Rabbi Meir, Lo imti harta shchitas treifa osa, bies ha'ever abedudal ba, is davar shebegufa, titire es ha'ubar, davar she'ena begufa, is how much more so? So what do we see here in Rabbi Meir? What was the argument and the reasoning of Rabbi Meir against the Chachamim? He says the following. In the case of a treifa, if you shech the treifa, it purifies the carcass of the treifa. Now he's got an aver miduldal ba. He's got an animal, and he's got a limb that was mostly detached from the animal. It's still dangling, meaning there's still a strip of skin that attaches it. And that's called davar shebegufa, meaning we see and we define that aver miduldal as being part of the mother's body. And why is that? Because it's only a meduldal, meaning it's still attached to the mother's body. And therefore, titire es ha'ubar, it makes logical sense that the shechita could be matir the protruding limb of this fetus. However, davar she'ena begufa, something that's not part of its own body, is, like, for example, the Ever Meduldal, is Reb Meir says that the shechita would certainly purify the limb. So there's a logical kal v'chomer over here.